August 1943. The Sicily campaign has been grinding on for several weeks. American troops are slowly pushing forward under a brutal sun, under constant fire, in conditions that are really hard to imagine if you weren't there. Over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Malaria tearing through the ranks just as hard as German bullets. Soldiers going days without proper sleep. Supply lines stretched thin. And the fighting itself, brutal, close, exhausting. The Germans weren't giving up ground easily. Every hill, every village, every road had to be taken the hard way. A lot of men by this point were running on empty. Patton during these weeks was constantly moving, visiting units, driving up to the front, showing up at field hospitals. He believed deeply that a commander needed to be seen by his men, not sitting behind a desk 20 miles back, but actually out there with them. And in a lot of ways, his soldiers respected that about him. He wasn't asking them to do anything he wasn't willing to do himself. He drove under fire. He went forward when other generals stayed back. His men knew that about him, and it meant something. So on August 3rd, he arrived at the 15th Evacuation Hospital. He walked through the wards the way he always did, stopping at beds, shaking hands, saying a few words to men who were badly hurt. He saw guys missing limbs, men with serious shrapnel wounds, soldiers who had taken bullets and were lying there bandaged up and pale. And Patton was genuinely moved by this. People who reduce him to a cartoon villain miss this part of who he was. He felt a real connection to his soldiers. He took their sacrifice personally. And then he came to one particular soldier sitting in a chair near the end of the ward. A young guy, 24 years old, Private Charles Cool from Mishawaka, Indiana. No visible wounds, no bandages, no blood. Just sitting there with his hands in his lap, staring at the floor like the lights were on, but nobody was home. Patton stopped and asked him what was wrong. Cool looked up and said he couldn't take it anymore, that his nerves were gone, that he just couldn't make himself go back out there. He said it quietly, not dramatically, just like a man who had reached the end of something and didn't have anything left. And something in Patton just broke. He grabbed Cool by the collar and slapped him across the face with his glove. Then he started screaming at him, called him a coward, said he was a disgrace to the uniform, said he had no business being in a hospital, taking up a bed that a real casualty could be using. The whole ward went silent. Doctors froze. Nurses froze. The other patients just watched. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Because this was General Patton, and you didn't step in front of General Patton when he was like this. Eventually, Patton stormed out. And the ward, slowly, came back to life. But here is the thing that makes this whole story more complicated than it first appears. Charles Cool was not faking it. He was not a coward looking for a way out of the fighting. His medical files showed he had been diagnosed with malaria. He had chronic diarrhea from weeks in the field. He was severely exhausted. His body had genuinely broken down after weeks of brutal combat in conditions that would break most people. The doctors knew this. They had examined him. He was in that hospital because he needed to be there. Patton either didn't know this or, in that moment, didn't care, because in his worldview, there was really only one kind of wound that counted. You could see it or you couldn't. And if you couldn't see it, then it wasn't real enough to keep a man out of the fight. Now, you would think, after something like that, Patton would at least pause. Take a breath. Maybe have a conversation with the medical staff about what they were seeing on the ground. But 10 days later, on August 10th, he walked into the 93rd Evacuation Hospital and did almost exactly the same thing. This time, the soldier was Private Paul Bennett, 21 years old. Had been in the Army for 4 years. His unit had been pinned down under constant artillery fire for days without relief. By the time he ended up in that hospital, he was shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't stop crying. He was barely coherent. The doctors had diagnosed him with severe combat fatigue, which is what they called it then. Today, we would recognize immediately what was happening to him. Patton walked up to him and asked what his problem was. Bennett managed to say that his nerves were gone, that he couldn't handle the shelling anymore. And Patton lost it again. He slapped Bennett harder than he had hit Cool. He actually reached down and pulled out his pistol and started waving it around while he screamed. He said he wouldn't have cowards in his army. He said Bennett was a disgrace. He tried to physically order Bennett back to the front on the spot. The doctors had to step in between them to stop it from going any further. It took several people to get Patton out of that ward. Word reached Eisenhower almost immediately. Reports came in from the hospital staff, from witnesses, from multiple sources. And Eisenhower's reaction was not the measured disappointment of a man who was mildly unhappy. He was genuinely furious. He sat down and wrote Patton a private letter that did not mince words at all. He told Patton that his behavior was disgraceful, that it was beneath the dignity of his rank, that it would not be tolerated. He ordered Patton to personally go back and apologize to both soldiers and to every witness in both hospitals. Not a written apology, in person, face to face. Eisenhower also worked very hard behind the scenes to keep the story from reaching the press. And his reasoning was cold and practical. Patton was the best offensive commander the United States Army had. The man had a gift for moving fast, hitting hard, keeping pressure on the enemy that almost nobody else could match. And D-Day was still months away. The war in Europe still had a long way to go. Losing Patton over this, as disgusted as Eisenhower was, felt like cutting off your nose to spite your face. So for a while, the story stayed quiet. Patton went and made his apologies. He stood in front of his men, division by division, and told them he was sorry. And something strange happened. A lot of his soldiers actually defended him. Some of them cheered him, because they knew Patton. They knew he was hard on them. They knew he pushed them to their absolute limit and sometimes past it. But they also knew that under Patton, they moved. Under Patton, they won. Under Patton, the casualty rates from long drawn-out stalemates were lower because he kept the momentum going. There was a complicated loyalty there that's hard to explain, but it was real. But then journalist Drew Pearson got hold of the story. On November 21st, 1943, he broadcast the whole thing on national radio, and the country erupted. Letters flooded into Congress. Letters flooded into the War Department. Senators stood up and called for Patton to be court-martialed, to be stripped of his rank. The public was genuinely outraged, and you can understand why. These were their sons out there, their brothers, their fathers, men who had volunteered or been drafted and sent across an ocean to fight a war. And the story they were hearing was that America's most famous general had walked into a hospital and assaulted a sick soldier in front of a room full of people. Patton was removed from command. And this is where it gets genuinely painful if you look at it from his perspective. Not because he deserves sympathy, necessarily, but because of what it cost him. He sat on the sidelines for 11 months. 11 months while other men led armies into battle, while history was being made without him. He watched from a distance as operations unfolded that he felt he should have been leading. He wrote in his diary during this period that he felt like a caged animal, that every day without command was a waste, that he was built for one thing, and being kept from that one thing was a kind of slow torture. And then December 1944 arrived. Germany launched its massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge. American forces were caught completely off guard. Units were surrounded. The situation at Bastogne was desperate. The weather was terrible. Visibility was near zero, and the pressure on Allied command was immense. And suddenly, in the middle of all that chaos, nobody was thinking about the slapping incident anymore. America needed its best attack dog off the leash, and Patton came back. He famously turned the Third Army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and drove north to relieve Bastogne in a move that military historians still talk about today. It was audacious, and it worked. But going back to those two soldiers for a moment, because they matter in this story just as much as Patton does. Charles Kuhl went on record years later and said he bore no grudge against Patton. He had thought about it over the years, and he understood, or at least he said he understood, the kind of pressure that everyone was under at that point in the war. Paul Bennett had a harder road. The combat trauma he was already carrying didn't go away just because a general screamed at him. And being publicly humiliated, being called a coward in front of a hospital full of people by the most famous general in the American Army, that kind of thing leaves a mark on a person that doesn't just fade when the war ends. Patton died in December 1945, just a few months after Germany surrendered. A car accident outside Mannheim. He had survived the entire war, all the combat, all the danger he voluntarily put himself in, and then died in a road accident in peacetime Germany. He never really had to sit with the full weight of what those two moments in those two hospitals meant in the long run. But we still talk about them, because they're not just a strange footnote in a famous general's biography. They tell us something honest about what happens when a person's greatest strength and their greatest blind spot are basically the same thing. Patton's absolute refusal to accept defeat or weakness in any form was what made him extraordinary on the battlefield. And it was exactly that same refusal that made him walk into a hospital and hit a sick man in the face and call it discipline.